Welcome back. This is just a quick video to ask a couple of questions. We had a few people ask about E85 with the standard ECU, so we just thought we'd like to set out what the standard ECU and what some of its limitations are and what it can do. So this is a Continental EMS 3110. This was found in most of the Megane III RSs. It's only the very late 2016 RS275 that had a slightly different ECU in it because that car had to meet Euro 6 emissions. What you notice about this ECU is it doesn't really have the capacity to add any additional sensors other than those that were installed by Renault at the factory. It runs the car wonderfully. You can't say there's anything wrong about it. It does everything kind of nice. The only thing that you do need to be aware of is that it uses a Bosch LSF 4.2 lambda sensor. Now, a Bosch LSF 4.2 lambda sensor is it's a narrowband lambda sensor. Okay, the Megane 3 has two of these fitted. It has one fitted before the cat and it has an additional one fitted after the cat. This kind of limits how much it can closed loop trim for you, especially on wide open throttle conditions. So kind of makes it a little bit hard to really do too much in the way of flex with this ECU. You can make the ECU dedicated E85 only, or you can make it dedicated petrol. You can change the injectors, and we've all seen there's a lot of people out there that can do that for you. They just put a different injector scaling into it. We have a tuning house that we work with in France. They can clone you an ECU, so you can have one ECU that will do petrol and you can have another ECU that will run purely E85, and you could swap between the two if that's what you wanted to do. But basically with the EMS 3110, if that's what your car's got, you're pretty much committed to having a dedicated ECU or a dedicated fuel for that ECU. You can tell 3110 because it has these additional vanes. It's a cast body. It's still got a pressed metal back, but the top face or the front face, it's a cast body. So the other ECU that we were mentioning before is the Continental EMS 3125. These ECUs came out in 2016 RS275s. This ECU was designed to meet Euro 6 emissions. It has the capacity for a wideband lambda sensor, which is a LSU 4.9. Now we will be posting on our Facebook page the actual Bosch data sheets that we have for these things, so you can see that what we're saying is actually real. Even Bosch says that the LSF sensor that was in the previous model ECU is really a narrowband sensor, and it just gives an overall indication. Its range, as far as they're concerned, is it's all around that lambda 1 region. They don't really recommend using it for a wide open throttle tuning type application. So we've got product sheets from Bosch for the both the LSF, which has all the characteristics for the sensor and its voltage outputs, and also the LSU 4.9, which is what the later ECU runs. It runs one of these between the turbo and the cat, and then it has the narrowband type sensor as per the previous model after the cat. Now these ECUs, you can tell because it's a pressed metal front case and a pressed metal rear case. The other thing you need to be careful of with cars that have this ECU is that the small connector is pretty much the same between both cars. These last two connectors, they're completely different. The pinouts to them are completely different. You cannot use a later model engine harness in an earlier car. Basically, you cannot interchange these two ECUs. They are completely different. This connector here is the same, but the engine harness is very much ECU specific. This ECU, if you have the right tuner approach it, because this lambda sensor, the LSU 4.9, will work and tune on wide open throttle. You can do closed loop lambda. So if you kind of set your aim in the middle with the E85, you can kind of have it trim up or down so that it'll look after, and with some adaptive tuning tables it can kind of hold the values that you kind of need. So this ECU, it's kind of possible to do a flex type of deal with it. What you do have to understand though is the flex is being done by a lambda trim. The flex can't be done by putting in a flex sensor, because as with the 3110, there's no capacity to be able to put an additional sensor into this ECU. So this here, this is a 4.9 lambda sensor. You can kind of tell because it's got this different style plug on it. If I go back to the narrowband sensor, this is the kind of plug it has, and you'll see this up beside the coil packs. So this is the 3125. Once again, we can clone these, so you can have an E85 computer or you can have a petrol computer if you want to, but you probably can with this computer, if your car's fitted with it, you probably can do kind of a form of flex with it. Now, this is the Motec ECU that we run. We've integrated all of this, we've written all the code so that it interacts with the car. The car, as far as the car is considered, thinks that it's the ECU that it left the factory with. All the factory features work, doesn't throw check lights or any of that kind of stuff, and it was always designed to work with an external interface that talks to it on CAN with a wideband 4.9 lambda sensor. This ECU can accept a flex sensor, so that you probably get a slightly better result out of putting ethanol into the car, because it can also default to an ethanol ignition map, or it can default to a petrol ignition map, depending on what the flex sensor tells the ECU that the current configuration of ethanol is. If it's in between E85 and 0, then you can program into it kind of a blend table, so how much you want it to go towards the ethanol ignition table or how much you want it to go towards the petrol ignition table. What you also need to understand with this particular sensor as well, or ECU rather, is that you don't really need to change the fuel map, because the fuel map in all of these ECUs is a volumetric efficiency map. If you have already programmed in and calibrated that volumetric efficiency table correctly, the volumetric efficiency table doesn't change depending on whether it's ethanol or petrol, because as far as the engine goes, like the volumetric efficiency table, all it's doing is calculating how well that engine fills that cylinder with air for that cycle, and then the ECU calculates how much fuel it needs to put into that cylinder to achieve the desired fuel mixture aim for that cycle, depending on the VE table. So you don't need to change any of that. The only thing that you do have to understand, and there's another table and number you've got to change here, is that the flow rate of ethanol through an injector is slightly different to the flow rate of petrol through the injector. So even though you may have it calculated perfectly for petrol, and you have the linearization table, which Motec supplies for all common injectors, can be spot on and perfect, because you've put a different fuel through it, it will change how much fuel is actually going through. Normally what you find is, for most injectors, this difference is somewhere between 7 and 15%. So in the Motec software, we generally put in -10 is normally a pretty good kind of starting point, and then we might trim that up or down. We don't necessarily have to go back to the VE table to fix any of that. What you will find though is, because E85 is 106 or 107 octane, generally the car can take a little bit more timing, and that's generally where you will finish up making a little bit more power. If you're using the other ECUs, you're kind of relying on the fact that maybe it's trying to put in a little bit more timing, and it's relying on the closed loop knock control to have kind of taken that out or mapped it back and done some adaptive learning so that timing moves back from that optimum on petrol, but maybe it can stay on that optimum on E85. I hope this has been helpful. We've just tried to outline why you can or why you can't run E85 in various injectors. The only other thing that we'll say is the Megane III RS has a 495cc at 3 bar injector fitted standard. Bosch make a 731 cc at 3 bar injector that's from the same family. It has exactly the same physical appearance. if you kind of do the sums and everything else, and we have done on the dyno, you can put that ECU in, not the ECU, the injector into the factory ECUs, and it's going to kind of be pretty close for running on ethanol without really having to change too much in the whole thing. If you are going to do it though, you do need to run it on a dyno to make sure that the fuel mixture is correct. If anything, it should probably be 3, maybe 4% rich, but that's on the safe side. But you do need to run on. What you do need to also check is that the fuel pump can keep up. Now, if your engine retune isn't too radical, the factory fuel pump, it's going to go pretty close to keeping up. If yours is a bit more, there's a whole heap of videos out there on upgrading the fuel pump in your fuel pump basket. Generally you'll find a Dietzwerk 65C or a 300C. They'll fit in quite nicely. You don't really have to change anything too much with the wiring. If you are going to do that though, as we say, we strongly recommend that you do get a dyno just to check it's safe. The other thing we'd probably suggest maybe you get is that you get a second wideband lambda kit with a gauge, so that you can actually see that it's running at the safe numbers. Like, run it on petrol first, see what numbers it kind of runs, wide open throttle, and then if you do the other, just check it's the same. But we can't stress how important it is, if you want to prevent engine damage and you are going to change the injector, that you need to do a before and an after dyno with an external wideband sensor, just so that you can check that it's going to be safe. But it is another way of doing it if that's what you want to do, or if you send your ECU to us, we can organise to have the thing retuned or remapped back and supply the ECU back to you. We can also clone it and send you back an ethanol ECU and or an E85 ECU or a petrol ECU. But either way, we hope that just kind of clears up some stuff. I think and what everyone would realise is, if you really do want to do the flex thing, the safest way is probably to go down the Motec path. We've been running these things on ethanol for ages. We have so many customers out there that can put petrol in their car if they can't get to an E85 service station, or they put ethanol back in it, or if they've had petrol in it and they're going to the track and they want to put ethanol in it, you know, they'll get the tank low and put it in. And you know, even our test car here at the moment, that had half a tank in it, we put ethanol in it, we drove it, it went from being E10, because we were doing some tuning on E10, back to E54, I think we finished up at. It drove just, you wouldn't have even known that we changed the fuel in it. It drove exactly the same on either, and it calibrated for the change of fuel as it mixed in the tank as well. The Motec ECU with the flex sensor is by far the best, the safest, and probably the easiest solution. But it's not to say it's the only solution. If you really want to go down the path with the factory ECUs, as long as you're happy to have a dedicated ECU, it's probably doable. But what you have to understand is, if you don't or can't find a service station that sells the E85 and your tank's running low and you put petrol in it, it's going to run incredibly rich, and there is a chance that you might foul a plug or it'll misfire. That's kind of where you're at. But once again, thanks for taking the time to watch. We hope this has cleared up a few things with the with trying to run E85 in these cars. We know from the dyno, these cars correctly tuned, they love E85. We see a little bit of a gain. It's not a massive gain, it's an 8% horsepower gain, but we see temperature come out of them. They're happier. We can get to the mean best torque number with ignition timing. It's just a fuel that they run really, really well with. And if you use an E85 injector, and Bosch do make injectors that they do say is an E85 injector, if you run those injectors, we don't really see any of the issues that you'll hear everyone else talk about. Most of the time when they're talking about having an issue with E85 in their car, or you have to flush it, they're generally using an injector that was never designed for E85, and they're really unhappy running E85, and that's why they have issues. But once again, thanks for your time. Catch you next time.